Thanks, Elizabeth, and thanks, Lyndal. So yeah, I guess, you know, we're familiar with the context of the environment that we're dealing with now, and there's uncertainty on all the factors. And so I'm just going to zoom straight into the merchandise planning side of things. Just about every factor that we would normally rely on to do our jobs well is an unknown at the moment. So whether it's planning the future sales, understanding our stock flow, understanding what the environment's going to look like from a discounting point of view, all of those things are impacted. And the truth is that we're all speculating. But the fact that we're in that situation doesn't mean that we can't be planning and shouldn't be planning for what comes next. So instead of being paralyzed by some of those unknowns, there are some things that we can start doing. Elizabeth's just talked through a number of things in terms of your supply position. From a planning point of view, I think the first thing is really that OTB and cash flow concern. So for some businesses, when this first hit, it actually might have given them a little bit of welcome relief where they got to burn through perhaps an overstock position. It's not uncommon for businesses to err a little bit on the overstocked side of things. And so initially, as supply got a little bit more interrupted, so businesses could sell through some of their overstocks and get into a bit of a cleaner position, which might be a really fortunate thing in terms of the carryover of summer stock, certainly here in Australia. And so each business is going to have left off at a slightly different point. I think it was probably mid-March that I was hearing of drop-offs of 20 to 30% in sales, whereas, you know, more recently I'm hearing 80%. And of course, some businesses have closed altogether, relying only on their online channel. And while there might be big growth in an online channel, it's not enough to compensate for the closure of however many bricks and mortar stores. So what that means is that in addition to dampened demand on the part of the consumer, we've got a narrower channel to do our sales through, and that depressed sales has implications for your stock holding. So really the first step, I think, is to assess your stock position, really take a good hard look at the stock that you own, segment it. Some of the filters that you can put through is obviously the seasonality of the stock. Get a good understanding of which stock supports which seasons. Get a good understanding of the fashionability of that stock. We might find that the customer is more forgiving in terms of how on-trend fashion needs to be going forward. And there might be some ways that we can tweak some ranges and freshen them up and have them still be relevant. But likely the more highly seasonal the product is and the more fashionable it is, the more it's losing value on a daily basis. So those are things to consider there. Some of the options that you might have, whether now or into the future, of how to deal with that stock. Of course, markdowns, but bearing in mind everybody's going to be pulling that lever, and that really starts to shift how effective your markdown strategies are, whether you can use the same percentages you have before. There might be some opportunities around writing stock off, donating it, pushing it through resellers, and of course, pulling the levers that Elizabeth's been talking about, whether you delay things, push things out, cancel them. But the thing to remember as well is where you do have evergreens in your range, whether you call them core or basics or repeat products, those are the ones to preserve because they're not high risk for your offer. So if there was something that would be normally part of your regular discounting process to be promoting those, maybe some percentage off, you might not need to do that. Those might be the ones that you could afford to preserve now through holding back on any discounting activity and try and have them run a little bit longer at full margin. So just bear in mind not to paint everything with the same brush, to be really tactical about how you approach that stock, but I also really encourage you to be very realistic. You know, under normal circumstances, and we all know these aren't normal circumstances, there can be a tendency to not want to take markdowns, to delay markdowns, to not cut as deep as maybe we should. But the risk in not really being realistic about your stock holding and the true value of that stock is that it can influence all the further decisions that you make when you're trying to order in for whichever time period we're going to need to order for, and some of that is still an unknown. You really need to know what you've got. You really need to know how productive it is so that you can make good decisions about what else you need, what gaps you're going to need to fill. And so I really do urge you to be very realistic about that. Take a good look in the mirror, and don't deceive yourself that your stock is worth something it's not, because when shops are open again and you want to do the sales, if that's not good stock, if it's not productive stock, it's not going to drive sales, and it's certainly not going to drive sales in a really competitive environment. So be honest with yourself on that front. Thank you. I think it's also worth noting that a lot of planning principles do still hold, even though our environment is so disrupted. And I think, you know, often people who aren't planning people who are planning people as well can feel like, oh, planning requires structure and it requires a lot of stability to work well. I think a lot of planning principles do still hold. It's just some of our reference points that might shift, or some of our benchmarks. So, and also just at the moment, just that a lot of those cycles need to be shortened. So, you know, whether it's trade or review, those things are still relevant. You just need to do them more often. When it comes to allocation for those stores that are still open, and you know, they might not be at the pointy end of fashion, but there are definitely still apparel retailers trading. When it comes to allocation, it might just be little bits more often. Same with markdown. You might, as opposed to choosing a markdown strategy and going with it, it's a little bit more of take a little step, review it, take another little step. So all of those activities are still relevant. It's just doing a little bit more often. Yeah, so I think that moving into the next few months, it's still going to be a drip feed of information. We're still going to have to just really be on our toes. I think the really key thing with this, though, is that strategy is still warranted. So it's something that, again, at the best of times, some businesses do well and others don't do as well, in terms of going, what do we really stand for? What are we really about? Why are we doing what we're doing? And I think just because things are a little crazy at the moment, that doesn't mean we don't still need a strategy. Just because we know things are going to continue to shift, that doesn't mean we don't need a strategy. It just means we need flexibility alongside that strategy. So I think it is just as important as it ever was, if not more so, to be really clear on who you are, what you stand for, what's your USP, solidify those sorts of things. They don't have to be set in stone, but what they will give you is focus. They will help you define your priorities, and they will also give you something to measure back against. If you're not really clear on what you're trying to do, and you just have fallen into a reactionary space, it's very hard for you to evaluate how are you doing and are you actually making progress. And particularly when some of your reference points, you know, often we would compare to last year's numbers, we'd compare to comp sales, we'd be trying to grow our margin and our profitability. A lot of those numbers aren't going to be as valuable as reference points, at least in the short to medium term. But if we have a strategy and we define around that what good looks like and what we're hoping to achieve, even if those are baby steps, we can monitor how we're going, and we can know if we're on track, and we can measure what isn't working and course correct accordingly. So I think that's a really important starting point for businesses in amongst all of the uncertainty, is to still anchor themselves that way and then build multiple scenarios. For merchandise planning, I think this is a really key activity to start getting into, whether you're using specific planning software, which would certainly help, or whether you are using Excel-based tools, creating lots of scenarios based on those stock positions that you've identified, and then starting to work through multiple time horizons to ask yourself, I understand now what my stock position is. If we reopened at the end of May, what would that mean? What would the season be that we're opening our doors into? How well does our stock holding support that? And what would we need to bring in to complement that? If we opened our doors at the end of July, what would that mean? If we only open our doors in September, what would that mean? So I think having multiple scenarios, you can build them now because we are in a little bit of a holding pattern. It just means that when you start getting new information coming through, you can trigger them really quickly, you can tweak them really quickly, and instead of starting from a standing start, you can actually already be in motion because you've got this framework set up already. So I think scenarios is a really important activity to get stuck into now. Yeah. Yeah, look, again, it depends. Each business is going to be in a different position in terms of their capacity, their cash positions, all of those sorts of things. But again, if you're a business that has 200 stores and at the moment you're only trading out of your online store, that does suggest there might be some capacity within your planning team to do some other things. So it is a good time to look at doing that analysis you never got around to, or even doing an implementation or continuing an implementation, so that when you come out of this, you have the tools and the foundations that you need to be really nimble and flexible going forward. So I do think that these are times that you can be working through all the things that you are on your wish list that you don't normally get to do or get to do to the degree you'd normally like. It's a great time to redirect some of that capacity to those activities in the businesses where that makes sense. I absolutely know there are businesses that are running so fast that they can barely breathe, but there are other businesses where there is a little bit of quiet time. Go back and make some great induction materials for when you're growing your team in the future, so that people can actually onboard really well. Go back and automate some of those templates that you've built in the business, but that you knew you could have done better if you had a little bit more time around them. And certainly I'd say the businesses that can continue on with your system and process work, because there will continue to be unknowns about what it looks like when we come out the other side of this. And I think the more that you can do to enable your activities there, and the more you can make them more efficient, the better position you're going to be in.
Right.
I definitely think it is. And again, people might be more limited in, depending on how much they're trading at the moment, on what sort of reads they can get. So if you're in a little bit of a hibernation, you might not be able to do as much testing, but I would certainly encourage you to still build up your framework. Trialing is something that gets talked about a lot, certainly in fashion businesses. And it's a really worthwhile thing to do. And by trialing, we mean something new is going to, come into our business. We want to test it out. We want to see how the customer responds. We want to establish a rate of sale. And then if we get the right reads, we'll take it further. And what I found in a lot of businesses through my career and running my own business is that concept of trialing is certainly very familiar. And a lot of the right language gets used around it. But what I sometimes see happen is that the execution is a little loose. So we talk about it at the beginning, oh, we're going to trial this, and then we're going to do this and that, but it doesn't really get followed through with that same precision. And so I think right now what people could be doing is tightening up what that test and respond framework looks like. So really get clear about what would you be testing for? What are you measuring for? How are you going to measure it? What are the KPIs and metrics that are going to tell you whether it's doing well, whether it's achieving what you need it to? If it does well, what are you going to do about that? How quickly can you get back into stock? Which stores are you going to test it in, and which stores do you intend it to go to if it is successful? If it doesn't do well, then what will you do to exit that stock? What's your plan B? What next is in the pipeline? So I think there's a lot of things that can be thought through now to get that test and respond or trial framework really tidied up. You could probably make some little templates to support that. And you can either start using it now, or when you start trading more normally in a few months' time, you've got that embedded in place, and you can start using it to pump things out and see, because there are going to be shifts. There might be permanent shifts in buying behaviors. There could be permanent shifts in your mix. Some things you might have discovered through this period that you do better than you thought you did, and you might want to continue on that path. Other businesses might want to go back to what their original footprint or offering was. So as we navigate through all of those different shifts, that test and respond framework, I think, will serve you well to figure out what's working, what's not, how do you deal with it, and to really tidy that up and be disciplined with it. We also want to make sure that we don't create a new one of these problems within a few months after opening. And so something that I think is really important on that front is the realism of your sales forecasts moving forward. And, I've touched on doing, little things often and taking baby steps. I think the importance of setting a sales forecast that is quite sober. Yes, there will be businesses that come out of the gate really fast, and there will be some customers who start shopping again like nothing ever happened. But I do think there's also going to be some aftershocks. I do think there will be some permanent shifts in the way people think. There'll be some permanent or very long-lasting impact financially for people. Until we get a gauge of what that consumer demand really looks like, I would encourage planners out there to be quite conservative and rather get yourselves into a chase position for your stock than be under pressure to compensate too quickly for lost sales. And there will be pressure because businesses will still have costs that they've carried through this time. You know, financial positions are not going to be pretty. But I'd say you need to be strong about standing your ground on those sales forecasts, because sales drive stock. If you overinflate your sales forecast, you are going to overbuy. And that will just be another knock-on effect that will cause pain to your suppliers and supplier relationships, more discounting, more profit erosion. I don't want to sound like a doom and gloom person, but part of what I have to do is make sure that I have your back on how to navigate some of this. And I really encourage you to be cautious and take those baby steps and build it back in a solid and sustainable way, and not be pressured or not feel the pressure to get back on track too quickly, because you will create a new stock problem.
Your advice.
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds great.
So I think one of the things when we emerge into a new world to be very much on the front foot with is where you stand from a foreign exchange and a pricing point of view. I believe that the deck might have been reshuffled quite significantly. Just the dynamics, of course, of supply and demand impact pricing. They'll impact cost prices. They'll impact retail prices. The degree of discounting in the market is going to weigh in on that. So I really do recommend being on the front foot with understanding your pricing models, how they're going to be affected with price changes potentially coming through from your suppliers, and also currency shifts. So, you know, whether you've hedged with the US dollar, what's that going to look like when we come out of all of this in terms of that foreign exchange, and also those businesses that operate globally, where your retail pricing sits might have shifted as well in terms of how currencies all translate. So that all washes through to your margin position, and it might impact your mix across the different countries that you operate in. So there are definitely some things to reestablish in the space of pricing and foreign exchange. And in terms of your business as usual type activities, again, I think it's put them all through that lens of what actually adds value. Don't just start doing them all again to tick the boxes. I think, you know, even down to your regular agendas and, you know, what you cover in a meeting, tweak those to be the things that matter the most, and tweak the frequencies so that they support you in your decision making. It's okay for those things to settle back into a new pattern. And similar to we touched on before, you know, your calendars, your discounting schedules, anniversarizing activity, those things are not hard and fast. You're really going to need to evaluate your circumstances and use measures that are more relational measures. You know, like I said before, we used to looking at last year as a reference. It might be more relevant now to look at rate of sale, to look at your drop or your increase on the previous month or the previous week. Relationship measures between sales and stock that give you more of a performance guidance. I think those are the things that are going to carry you forward more so than some of your old tried and true methodologies. But at the same time, don't throw them out. I think it's worth doing all of your analysis, and I think it's worth getting your budget started. By that I mean, again, taking that strategy and starting to translate it into your financials. They will be a lot more fluid. You'll need to revisit them a lot more often. But I really suggest that you extend them over a longer time period. I actually think it's worth starting to get into 2 and 3 year budget horizons, because the flow through from each period into the next, I think, is going to be really critical. And I think you're going to need to monitor that margin progression and that mix progression over a much longer horizon. So those are some of the shifts that will need to happen, I believe, as businesses get started again. Yeah, I'd like to charge more than a penny for my thoughts on that one if I had the right answer, because it's a massive challenge. And I think at the moment what a lot of retailers are experiencing is that their money is tied up, their cash is tied up in their winter stock, which they're not anticipating being able to sell. If they can't sell it, they don't have the money to buy their summer stock. So it's real, it's critical. I think it's going to come back to what I mentioned before around evaluating how much of your stock falls into which buckets and figuring out which components of your stock you can still use, repurpose, carry over if you can get financial arrangements made to then still give you enough money to buy your next season's stock. You might find that you can reuse that stock later on. I'm not normally a proponent of putting stock away and bringing it out in another season. I prefer to deal with, I prefer to buy the right amount in the first place and deal with what you own in the moment and not carry it over. But that is something that some businesses are going to have to consider is, can you put it away for next year and bring it out? Yes, maybe fashionably speaking, it's not hot off the press, but I do think consumers will be a little bit more forgiving there. And one of the other things that that you could possibly think about, particularly if you have a larger store network, is when you reopen, maybe regrading some of your stores into being outlet stores, even though they wouldn't normally be, so that you can have two channels to work through your stock. So you can simultaneously get going with your new offer, bring in your spring and summer product, but also have a channel to exit overstocks from current season. Those things don't sell as well in the season that they weren't bought for, but that is still an option for some businesses to take some of their maybe C or D grade stores and have slightly different marketing, slightly different messaging, and push some of your stock out through that channel simultaneous to staying on brand and bringing your new stock in and putting that into your AB stores. So that is maybe a mechanism that some businesses could look at to try and navigate it. And then, donating and writing off and cancel as much as you can. Sorry. Yep, I'll jump in. I think still important to have strategy, important to be flexible, do lots of replanning. In the short term, do lots in little bites, so do it more frequently but little steps. But when it comes to starting to lay your groundwork, supported with a strategy, start looking at longer time frames so you can really see the continuity of that flow. Get on the front foot with models for how you're going to test and respond. Get on the front foot with understanding impacts to your pricing, both cost and retail prices, and how that's going to impact your margins and your overall mix of your business across different currencies and countries. In terms of your markdowns, be clear on why you're doing them. Pull back on anything you don't have to mark down if it's more evergreen. And stay in sync with your marketing. I know I didn't say that before, but don't be pulling in different directions and don't be disappointing the customer when you come out on the other side of this. Be in sync so that the marketing message matches what you actually have in stock and what you can get, and isn't making too much noise about something that you actually can't support. You don't want to disappoint the customers at this time.